And I'm happy to turn it over to Glenn to get us started with Housing 101.
Thanks very much. Being an older person, I'm going to try and share the screen. You know, technology is not my best attribute, but I'll try and share the screen with you. Has that come up?
Yeah, you should be good to go there now, Glenn. Perfect.
Very good. Okay. Great. All right, I'm going to try and leave some time at the end for questions to try and get everybody acquainted with things. We're all excited here because we're getting close to September and we're anxious to see some faces along the way, but we also know can be a little bit of anxiety looking for a house and looking for a place to stay and stuff like that. So I'm going to walk through here, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better sense of where you're at and what you need to be aware of along the way. So what we're trying to do is give you information so you don't end up in a disaster. You know, I know internationally it's difficult because there are potential scams on the internet, particularly some buy and sell websites where individuals can post free of charge. They'll post it. So you got to be very careful with that. One of the things I've been suggesting to avoid scams is have the landlord FaceTime you live. Don't do virtual tours, do a live FaceTime. You see the actual address of the house. You see them using a key to enter the place so that you know that they actually, doesn't guarantee it isn't a scam, but it's a better chance that it isn't. So where do you begin? I'm going to talk about things you need to consider before you even start your search. Know what that I'm in a place and stuff. Too often students take the first place they look at, and we suggest you wouldn't buy the first cell phone you look at. You do a little bit of research, look around, see what's available. It's much easier if you do the research and avoid something before committing, because once you commit, very difficult to get out of the situation. So we're going to talk about costs. We're going to talk about roommates. We're going to talk about the accommodation. We're going to talk about leases, and we're going to talk a little bit about lifestyle. Money, budget your dollars. A lot of people think, you know, they go out and rent a place. They haven't even thought, how much can I actually afford? So they're, you know, you need to budget, you know, are utilities included, not included? What other things? I mean, the good thing is you get a bus pass with your tuition, so that takes care of one cost. And we tell students, you know, take a 10-minute bus ride, you'll save $100 a month, right? So, but be careful, don't go too close to Western. Right now, the market closer to Western is going crazy, not so much near Fanshawe. So you want to think about. So think about how much you can afford. Typically, you're looking at $450 to $700 bedroom in a shared, or $900 to $1,200 for a one-bedroom apartment. You have to think about what it includes. You know, utilities included or not. Typically, utilities will cost you anywhere from $50 to $100 extra per month. You know, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. Maybe internet's included, maybe it's not. You need to think about where your income is coming for, because, you know, when rent day comes, landlords expect that money right then and there. They don't like to wait around for the money because they've got expenses as well along the way. How can I reduce my rent? Talk to your landlord, talk to your roommates, talk about jobs that you might be able to do around the house, whether that's cutting the grass, shoveling the snow, things like that. Yes, we will have snow for a lot of students that have never seen it. We will have significant snow probably. Landlords typically ask for payment up front. They typically ask for first and last month's rent. That's industry standard. But technically, if they're covered by the provincial rental legislation, which I'll talk about in a minute, they can only legally ask for 1 month's rent as a down payment. Insurance. You want to think about insurance. More and more landlords are requiring an insurance. Landlord's insurance doesn't cover you. So, fire, theft, liability. In the past, we've had two, it doesn't say it here, but we've had two international students. One cost $50,000 worth of damage and one cost $60,000 worth of damage in an inadvertent fire. So you need to be aware of that you're going to be liable for that. So you want to make sure you've got some kind of insurance along the way. Best way to get insurance in Canada or London, once you get here or whatever, just Google insurance companies in London and call around for the cheapest rate. So you're probably looking at anywhere from $300 to $400 a year on insurance. Sometimes landlords will ask for guarantors, which is very difficult for international students. Sometimes what landlords will say, if you're an international, you can't provide a guarantor. They ask for extra rent. If you can, try to negotiate maybe post-dated checks, which landlords can't require but can ask for, or automatic rent deposits out of a bank account. Landlords are less inclined to ask for a guarantor when you do that. Roommates, how many can I tolerate? Some people can't tolerate any roommates. Some are okay with 5 or 6. It's just personal preference along the way. But one thing you should know is never sign on a lease with roommates if you don't know them, because you then become liable for their actions and their debts. All right, so don't go into a place where there are other tenants and landlord wants you to sign on the same lease. Do not do that. Can you be honest with each other about your habits? Whether you're going to have friends over, cleaning habits, things like that. Your living habits work well together. Lots of people think they can get along, but then it comes down to cleaning the toilet, and that can start some fights, or dirty dishes will start fights between roommates or tenant mates. Sometimes visitors over, smoking, things like that will cause issues. A biggie is also money issues, like how do you share the toilet paper? Who pays for that? How do you, so you might want to set up a house account to look after those things. We have a sample roommate agreement on our website, so you might want to look at that to try and get, even if you do it after a week or so when you're in the place, talk to roommates about how you're going to live together. Bills and bill responsibility and bill payments, especially if utilities are not included. You want to think about those things. Roommate, it's nice if you get along, but the biggest thing with roommates is you just want to be able to tolerate each other. You may not be best friends. You may not end up being buddy-buddy. Like on Saturday, I met my roommate from second year, which was 42 years ago. All right, so it's great if you can remain friends for a long time, but not always. It's a matter of whether you can tolerate each other. All right, accommodations. How will I find a place and where to look? You want to think about a type of place. Do I want to be in a house? Do I want to be in an apartment? We recommend Fanshawe's listings to start with. Like I said earlier, you want to be careful about private for-profit websites. I'm not saying you can't use them, but I did a survey one year of students that came in to talk to me with problems. I dealt with 350 different students in a given year. Every single one of them found their house on a popular buy and sell website. All right, so you just want to be careful. I'm not saying don't use it, but be careful. You want to think about location. Are you at the main campus? Are you at the downtown campus? Are you at the South End campus? So you want to think about that. You want to think about whether you got a part-time job, you want to think about a grocery store. And, most of this can be found on Google Maps. You should be, if you haven't found a place already, you should be looking now. You might want to think about using our accommodation checklist, which is also on our website. You also want to think about bus routes. Like I said, you get a bus pass with your tuition. So you want to think about, is it close to a bus that goes to the campus that you're at? And does it have everything I need? I tell students, dishwashers solve a lot of roommate problems. They do. And the number of bathrooms and the number of bedrooms, it's okay to cut costs to share a bedroom, but realize that could be a pretty tight accommodation after 8 months. So you want to think about that. Are repairs needed? Certain repairs are required by the landlord, and I'll get into those in a minute. Certain ones are cosmetic and are not. If the landlord verbally promises you anything, get a written confirmation in an email saying that that work will be done at such and such address before a certain date. That way you can prove that the landlord promised it. Verbal promises are absolutely useless. Think about personal safety, the windows and locks on doors and stuff. How far is it a walk to the bus stop? Things like that you want to be careful about. You want to think about fire safety because each house is required to have smoke detectors on every level and outside bedroom, and they're supposed to have CO2 or carbon monoxide detectors as well. Think about escape routes. If you're in a basement bedroom, can you get out of a window? Windows are there's supposed to be at least one window in the basement that you have access to that you can get out. So you want to think about that as well. Now, this is a biggie because most landlords want a 12-month lease, and lots of students don't want 12 months because they only here for 8 months. But one thing I will say is if you're covered by the rental legislation that I'm going to get into in a minute, if you sign a 12-month lease for September, the good thing about it is you could store your stuff in the unit for the summer, and then next year, in second year or whatever, you would not have to sign a new lease. You could go month to month and just leave after giving your 60-day required notice. So 12 months is not bad if it starts in September, knowing you're going to be there more than 1 year. So think about that, and then be prepared that you might have to pay for the 12 months. This is a biggie. The Residential Tenancy Act of Ontario is a rental law that protects your rights as a tenant unless you share a bathroom or kitchen with the owner or the owner's family, or if you're a tenant of a tenant. So if there's something in the agreement that's illegal and you're covered by the RTA, the law will override it even though you signed it. But if you're a tenant of a tenant or share a bathroom or kitchen with the owner or the owner's family, you virtually have no rights, right? You need to be aware of what legislation will apply along the way. And I talked about this before, separate versus a joint lease. If it's a separate lease, you only have to worry about yourself. But on a joint lease, it means multiple tenants sign one document and you become liable for any other tenant on the lease. So if one tenant up and leaves and you're on a joint lease, landlord can come to you and say, pay that person's rent, and you chase them down. Guarantors, I mentioned it's not easy for international students. There are some workarounds with that, but some landlords are insistent on it, and probably half the landlords don't require a guarantor, so I usually suggest move on to the next landlord. Be aware of signing applications, because sometimes applications have a little clause in them that says you're bound by the lease if we accept you as a tenant. So we've had students sign 5 applications just thinking they're an application. Well, be careful, because they might be a binding contract. So don't sign it unless you're absolutely prepared to take the place. And as I mentioned before, get it in writing. You know, verbal is useless. And unfortunately, a number of international students will pay by cash. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but you want an immediate receipt, even if it's on a piece of scrap paper. You know, you just want the amount, the landlord, the address, things like that, that says you paid the rent. Because if you don't get something in writing that you paid, you know, 5-6 months later, the landlord might come back at you and said, you never paid for October. Get it in writing. Get it somehow in writing. Subletting, you know, you might be able to find a place where you're subletting from some other student. But again, remember, you're not covered under the RTA when you do that. So beware. Might be able to find a place cheaper or shorter term by subletting. It's important to have a good relationship with your landlord. It just makes things like getting things fixed whenever possible that much easier. Like I said, get things clear in the lease about cutting the grass, shoveling the snow, etc. Ideally, and I know this is hard for international, but ideally you would talk to the previous tenants or the most current tenants. They are the single best indicator of a good landlord. You know, you could even ask the landlord, hey, can I have an email from a previous tenant so I can check with them to see how they like the place or whatever. Get their experiences and how good the things have been. You want to think about, do I need a loud space or do I need a quiet space, right? So inclined to be a little louder with things, you're probably going to a house rather than an apartment building. If I need a quiet place, you might think an apartment building that's an end unit or a top unit, less neighbors beside you, less potential for problems along the way. You want to think about chores, dividing a rotating schedule with stuff, decorating. Even if you're living with people you've never lived with before or they're not on the same lease. Like I said, we have a sample roommate agreement on our website so you can talk and discuss out things like when friends can come over. Can they come over when they've got an exam the next day? Can they smoke? Can they stay overnight? Things like that that you have to be aware of. Lifestyle considerations. You know, there are a bunch of bylaws in the City of London, property standards in the condition of the property that the landlord must adhere to and you must abide by. You want to think about parking if you have a vehicle. I wouldn't say a lot of international students have cars, but just the odd ones that do, you want to make sure you have parking for it. Noise. In the City of London, the noise bylaw is 24/7. So I've seen students get tickets at 10 a.m. because they're getting ramped up for an exam or whatever. So just be aware, noise bylaw. Furniture bylaw, you can't have indoor furniture outside, things like that. Now, what's the landlord required to do once you're in the place? Maintenance. Doors and windows must operate properly and not be broken. Windows are required to have screens in the summertime. All bedrooms must have windows. We've had students live in rooms without windows, and that's a bit of a fire hazard along the way. Sometimes it's cheap, but it's dangerous. Like I mentioned before, smoke and CO2 detectors are required. During the winter months, heat must be 20 during the day and 18 at night. And that is required by law. Now, some students ask me, well, what about the summer? Is there no maximum? And unfortunately, no. I mean, it can be 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think 30 or 35. And it's very hot, very, very hot. And landlord's not required to do anything about it. Landlord is required to provide water, hot and cold, and they cannot shut it off. Sometimes landlords, if you haven't paid your rent, they'll shut off the water. They're not allowed to do that. The only reason to turn off the wire if they have to do short-term maintenance to repair a pipe or something of that nature. Electricity is required. Again, same thing. Can turn it off for short-term maintenance, but not as a penalty for non-payment of rent. Landlords are required to get rid of bugs in the place. The only thing that they can do is the cost of removing the bugs they can pass on to a student if they can show the student caused the problem. So I'll give you two examples that we've had more than once in the past. Some students have put a year's worth of garbage in the garage, which obviously causes mice and squirrels and whatever. And sometimes students have put a year's worth of empty beer bottles in the kitchen corner. Well, unfortunately, stale beer attracts cockroaches. So as long as you didn't cause the problem, and it's hard for the landlord to prove this, but landlords must take care of the problem even if you cause the problem. Same thing with mice, rodents, other things. What do you want to succeed? You want to be in a better living environment that's easier, because when you go to school all day, the last thing you want to do is dread coming home at night, right? You don't want to say, oh, I don't want to come home because I hate my roommate, I hate my landlord, I hate my bedroom, I live in a damp, windowless bedroom, things like that. So you need to do a little bit of research to make sure that you're comfortable with what you want to live in. So 4 main points to succeed that we tell people, all right? If possible, ask the current tenants about their landlord. As I mentioned earlier, single best way to avoid abandonment. Like other students are happy to talk about their landlord. They're happy to say, my landlord was an idiot. My landlord didn't fix this. My landlord didn't do that. Or conversely, they're happy to say, my landlord was great. They even gave us a pizza party for Christmas, right? So you wanna talk to them if possible, because they will really tell you what the landlord's like. We have a booklet called Renting in London. It's online on our website. It divides up much like the presentation I've just done about the costs and lease and roommates, etc. But it answers the typical questions that students ask with things. So, if you read this booklet, it might take you 20 minutes to read. You'll be far more educated with regards to your rights and what you can do if there's a problem in the place. I can't say this enough, and I'm repeating myself, but get it in writing. Landlords are notorious. Like anytime you go to a market, people will promise you lots of things. You go buy a used car, go buy a used product. People will promise you the world, hoping you'll buy. Well, not always the case that it's true. I mean, it might be, but if it's true, they should be willing to put it in writing in an email to you. And again, I'm going to say, get specifically what they promised in writing, specifically for what lease term, at what address. And if you really want to push the envelope a little bit, get a date that it's to be done by, with a penalty of a rent decrease until it's fixed. That will really convince the landlord that they get it done. Some landlords won't do this and will look at it as too much trouble. And you can make the decision, okay, I can live without that or whatever. But it's one sure way of getting something that's been promised to you. Do a roommate agreement. So like I said, this is really important if you're going into with friends, but it's even more important if you're going in with people you do not know. You want to get things on the table. Like I said, who's going to pay for the toilet paper? Who's going to clean the dishes? Who's going to clean the toilet? Whatever. You need to get things. And, we suggest things like an agreement where if I have an exam the next day, no roommates can bring a friend over, right? And you want to maybe have a typical exam schedule posted on the fridge or somewhere so people know when, it doesn't help if you got an exam the next day, but you didn't tell anybody and they're bringing friends over. So it doesn't help your situation at all. So you want to make sure that everybody's aware of things that might come up along the way so that you can can set out the rules for the situation. So if you need help, that's my email at Fanshawe. The one thing we do offer is a lease review service. So if you get a contract or an application or a lease or whatever, and you just want another pair of eyes to give you feedback, send it to me. All right. And I will get back to you with what to be aware of. If you're covered in Ontario under the Residential Tenancy Act of Ontario, the landlords are supposed to be using what's called the Ontario Standard Lease. And that became law this spring. And you can Google it and you'll see it. But if they're using something other than the standard lease, you can ask for the standard lease. However, if you're not covered by the RTA, landlord can use whatever they want. That's even more important to have a look at, because I can point out where you might run into issues with the landlord along the way. That's the phone number. You're not going to call that, unfortunately. Nobody, that's my Western phone number, actually. I work at both places, so there is somebody at that number right now. You want to look at the listings that are on the off-campus housing site at Fanshawe. So you just go to that website and click on off-campus housing. That'll take you to the website with listings. Like I mentioned, if you get too close to Western in looking, for various reasons, the rental market near Western is very tight. But towards Fanshawe, it's not as bad. I think part of it is Fanshawe's got more courses online than Western does with it, but there's a couple other reasons, mostly related to the pandemic. But the Canada Mortgaging and Housing Corporation, which is a federally operated agency, does a survey, an annual survey, where they look at vacancies that are available, rental vacancies that are available. And when it was taken late last fall and released early in the winter of this year, London had the highest vacancy rate it has seen in 5 years. So there is housing available, but sometimes you may have to think about going a little farther out than just immediately to the college. Because like I said, if you take a bus, 5-10 minutes, it's going to be cheaper. So you want to think about that with going out and along the way. I guess that's it for me. Like I said, I'm available at the email address posted. I don't look for housing, but I can tell you where you might look, and I can look at your lease and give you some feedback on it. But I'm happy to answer questions that might be coming in now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Glenn, for sharing all that information. For students that were interested in some of the resources that Glenn provided, I did include them in the chat. So if you just like to refer to the chat there, you'll see all of the links to the rental agreement, or the roommate agreement, the off-campus housing listing, some information about the Tenant Act as well. It's all included there in the chat. We have had a few questions come up in the chat, Glenn. I was wondering if you could tell us all a little bit about possible rental housing agents or real estate agents that may be able to help students with securing housing. Yeah,
there are some, and some of them actually post on Fanshawe's website, but I'm a little bit, there's not a lot in the way of agents that look for individuals. There are some companies which will show you their own properties, right? So I don't necessarily recommend them, because you're only going to see their properties. You're not going to see others along the way. But there's no agency that just kind of helps the student find a place other than landlords that are willing to show their own properties.
Okay.
So one like that would be the Mark, MARQ.
Yeah.
They will do that. So like I said, but they'll only show you their property. They won't take a student and look for them. There's no agency where you could pay them to find you your housing.
Yeah, so it would be limited options that they would be showing you. So you're best to kind of do your research yourself, right?
Yeah.
Now,
one of the things I've been saying this because the market's so tight at Western, one of the things that we've been suggesting, and I think this would work well for Fanshawe as well, find out where the bus routes are. You know, Oxford's a major bus route. And then go to Google Maps and look for apartments along the bus route and then contact those apartment units. It's one of the easier ways to find landlords along the way.
And using that planning tool as well, once you do find a place that you're hoping to rent from, you can put that location in on the map and find out from Google Maps where all the other, you know, essential needs are in relation to your apartment. So
yeah, correct.
So popular place to find housing. I have a person on the chat here who's noted that they've been advised to go to Kijiji. Can you just offer a little bit of information about Kijiji? Well, what should students be concerned about? Is this a place they could look?
The example I used, I didn't mention the website, but the example I used of the 350 students that came into me separately with problems with their rental, that is exactly where they found their housing. Okay. So I don't have a very good experience with that. I'm not saying there aren't reputable, but one of the things, both Western and Fanshawe eliminate landlords from their websites that have been problematic. Well, where do those landlords go to rent or to advertise? Well, they go to the free site that they can get, and that's one of them. Right. But I mean, it doesn't mean it's absolutely bad, but 350 in 1 year, all saying bad things about the source, kind of tells you something.
Right.
The other thing is there are Facebook groups that in London that students quite often go on to share. So it may be worthwhile looking for Facebook groups that, you know, sometimes somebody looking for a roommate will offer up something on their Facebook group.
And you can also even just Google the address of the house that you're interested in, or the apartment building that you're looking to possibly rent at, just to see if there are any reviews of those buildings as well, right? Yeah. So then I guess another question that's come up is just where would a student start then? So aside from the off-campus housing listing, like if you're starting your journey of trying to find an apartment here in London, how would you recommend a student start that process?
Well, other than, you know, they've done the budgeting and stuff like that in ahead of time, besides the website, then I would start looking at Google Maps and look for apartment buildings. I've done this myself. I've just entered apartments in London, Ontario on Google Maps, and then looked along the bus routes that I know exist and looked and clicked on apartment buildings that are on Google Maps, and then tried to contact those landlords to see if they have any vacancies. Okay. It's one way to know that you're at least on a bus route to campus, and it's another way to look for places.
Yeah. So aside from just looking at the listing, being a little bit more of an investigator and contacting these apartments directly that may not be advertising. For sure, that's an awesome tip. Demir asked a really good question here in the chat. He's wondering if there's a limit to the number of tenants in a specific space.
All right, this is a bit complicated, but I'll try to explain it.
Thank you.
Anywhere in London in a house, you can have 3 separate leases, not tenants, leases. there is a bylaw in London that you need to have at least 100 square feet of livable space per tenant. All right, so per person. So if you got an apartment that is 400 or 500 square feet, you can't have 7 people in it, right? You could have 4. It'd be a little tight, but you got to be aware it's 100 square feet of livable space. Now, is anybody going to complain? Maybe not, but you need to be aware that people could complain. We've had houses with 20 to 25 people in them, and the neighbors complained to the city. So the city would investigate, they'd issue an order to the landlord, and the landlord would have to evict people to get down to the proper number. All right, so it's a bit of a gamble. You could have a few extra people in the place, but you need to be aware if there's any issues. I mean, you know, the situation with the houses with too many people in them, mostly the neighbors complained because there were too much traffic, too many cars going in and out. They actually thought the house was a drug haven, but it was just people sleeping there because it's the only place they could find to crash.
Yeah, and you know, that's when it becomes more complicated as well with just relationships with roommates.
Yeah.
If you're living with 25 people, it's hard for everyone to get on the same page and be quiet on a certain night when someone has exams, because there's probably going to be exams every night with that many people, right? Yeah,
very true. Very, very true. The more roommates you have, the more, I mean, your rent will probably be cheaper, but the more complications that can come up. You know, just even in personality conflicts.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So another question we have here is about finding apartments and how long it typically takes from when you sign the lease to kind of being able to move in. How much time would you suggest students leave for securing housing?
Well, if you haven't been looking already, you're behind the game, right? You should have been looking before now. Here's why. In Ontario, if you're covered by the Residential Tenancy Act of Ontario, a lease automatically goes month by month when it's over. So as an example, I signed a 12-month lease. I lived in the same apartment for 15 years, never signed another document because the lease automatically goes month to month. But if I wanted to leave at the end of the lease, or when I did leave after 15 years, I have to give 2 months notice to leave in writing. So for availability for September, people would have had to inform their landlord before July 1st. Right? So places for September are going like hotcakes, like I said. So you need to get on it right away. In years when the pandemic wasn't around, international students could show up at late August, September, and there'd be all kinds of housing for people to find. And there's still some element of that around Fanshawe, but the market has changed because of the pandemic, and people are scrambling a little bit to find housing.
And it's also not as safe as well with the multiple roommates. You do need to consider your ability to kind of be distanced from other people, because you wouldn't want to be in a house with so many people if someone were to get sick as well, right? Well,
that's the other thing. A lot of landlords are not allowing as many people, or not renting to as many people because of the pandemic. And I know people that have basement apartments in their house that are not renting this year because of the pandemic. Right. So that's decreased the supply.
So Glenn, we have another question here about pets. Can you talk a little bit about what someone can expect if they are bringing a pet into a rental accommodation?
All right, so there's 2 scenarios. One is when you're covered by the Residential Tenancy Act of Ontario, a landlord can say no pets in their lease. However, they cannot enforce it unless the animal is, I call it the 3D rule, dangerous, damaging, or disturbing. All right. So if it's a pit bull, boa constrictor, or whatever, they could restrict it. But if it's a well-behaved animal, they cannot stop you from having a pet unless you are renting in what's called a condominium. The condo laws override the RTA, so they could restrict pets in a condo, but generally they can't. Now, if you're not covered by the RTA, landlord can dictate any rule they want, including no pets. And obviously, if you did bring a pet, even under the RTA, you'd be responsible for any damage, whatever, whether they chew up the carpet or, I'm going to tell you, if an animal urinates on a carpet or whatever, it's almost impossible to get that out, and it might cost you the replacement of the carpet.
So students really just need to be aware of their responsibilities around having a pet. And I'd also suggest that's probably a really good conversation you'd want to have with your landlord, just so you're aware of what their expectations are of your pet as well, right?
Just be aware, a lot of landlords will absolutely say no pet, which they can't enforce if they're under the RTA and not in a condominium.
Okay. So
just they don't want the hassle. They don't want the hassle of a pet. And if you're not on a lease with roommates and they're on separate leases, they can easily complain to say, my life is being disturbed by your pet. And that would be one of the 3 Ds.
Okay. So we have a question here about students who are currently overseas and they're looking for housing in Canada. So would you recommend they wait until they arrive in Canada before they secure housing? Or would you say it's reliable for them to book accommodations from overseas?
In a normal year, I would say wait till you get here, because we've said in the past, don't take a place sight unseen. But the market has changed. I'd be more inclined to suggest you look now, if possible, delay the transfer of money till you get here. But like I said, I can't say with any confidence that there will be places when you get here in September. There will be some, but they may not be the most convenient. Like I said, the Canada agency said London had the highest vacancy rate in 5 years. But you might be in the south end of London and you might have to bus to the main campus, which might take an hour.
Right.
If you're gonna look at it, just take the safety precautions. Look at Google Street View of the place to make sure it exists. Get the landlord to do a FaceTime with you, showing the address of the property, showing them unlocking it and walking into the place.
Yeah, that's really good advice to do that FaceTime. And that way you're sure that they have the key, you're seeing the address, and also just getting the chance to look around at the actual layout of the apartment, because sometimes the pictures can look a lot different than seeing it in a video, right?
Well, and the other thing is, Sean Connery just got screwed by Airbnb, right?
Oh.
It happens all the time to even movie actors, right? So you need to be careful about this kind of stuff. I mean, and Airbnb is another place students are looking at.
Yeah.
The only thing I'm going to say to you, you're going to pay a huge premium to go Airbnb. I know some students are paying $1,000 a month for Airbnb. And that's not even just an apartment. That's 1 bedroom in an Airbnb.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe just as a short-term measure while you're looking for a permanent place, may be okay, but you certainly would want to get into something more affordable rather than booking something like that for your study period.
Yeah.
We have a question here about any special safety measures that are required by landlords based on the pandemic. Is there any special cleaning or anything like that? No.
No rule whatsoever related to housing. The only thing we can suggest is, you yourself actually taking an alcoholic wipe to wipe down areas that you're going to use, etc. But there's no requirement based on the pandemic for rentals. The one thing the government did do was they put a moratorium on rent increases in 2021, and they put a moratorium on evictions. Right? Not on the requirement to pay your rent, but on the requirement of paying it right now. So landlord can't evict people. That's going to change. I'm pretty sure that's going to change pretty quickly. But that has been the case.
Yeah. And that the cleaning situation, especially now, is something you should certainly talk to your roommates about. So you guys are all on the same page with keeping things sanitized and making sure you're, practicing safe cleaning measures during this time. So
well, the other thing I would say to you is, I'm not sure I would live in a place that people aren't vaccinated. We're requiring people in residence to be vaccinated, but students off campus, no requirement whatsoever. So you might talk to your roommates and see who's vaccinated or not. And you could even say to the landlord, if I'm sharing with other students, I want their email because I want to inquire if they're vaccinated or not. Not that that's going to prove it necessarily, but it's something that's worthwhile considering.
Yeah, that's a really good point, just to make sure you're protecting yourself. And I'll just remind all students that when you arrive in Canada, you're certainly eligible to go to the London Middlesex Health Unit, which is our health unit here in London, and you can receive a free vaccination, both first and second vaccinations. There's no requirement to have a health card. You can just go in, book an appointment, and get yourself vaccinated for sure. It's a good idea. So we do have about 10 minutes left in our time together today. So if anyone had any final questions for Glenn, welcome to add it into the chat now. This is just a question about rental prices. I know you went over this sort of at the beginning of the presentation, but if you could just mention again, roughly what can a student expect to spend on a one-bedroom apartment here in London?
Yeah, so in the presentation, I said it's $450 to $700 in a shares and $900 to $1,200 for one bedroom or a bachelor studio apartment. It might be a little, I don't know if the prices around Fanshawe have been affected like around Western, but what would typically be $650, $700 in a bedroom in a shared house has gone up to $900.
Wow.
That's recent. That's very recent. Like I said, I don't think the rental market has been quite affected as much in the Fanshawe area as it has in the Western area, but just be aware that prices are going up. So you're going to look at probably on the higher end to find places.
Okay. So yeah, it's good to know. It's definitely, it all goes into that budgeting piece, right? You don't want to get something that you can't afford and run into problems down the road when you realize, uh-oh, now I have to work more to afford my rent and I can't focus on my studies. So definitely make sure you're keeping your budget in mind when you're planning your rental accommodation. Sort of a more practical question for you, Glenn. We've had a few people ask if you have a copy of your presentation to share. Would you happen to be able to share the PowerPoint, or?
I thought you guys were recording it and were putting it somewhere where people could access.
Yes, we are. So we are recording this session and it will be available on YouTube.
Okay.
The other thing I'll say is that all the links I provided in the chat. So if you were looking for things like the link to the off-campus housing listings or any of that stuff, all of that is available in the chat there for you. So you can certainly access that there.
Well, and if somebody emails me, I'm happy to send it.
Okay.
Right? But
yeah.
if it's in your YouTube channel, it's right there.
Perfect. Okay. So we have a question from Dorothy that's just again going over maintenance required by the landlord. Would you be able to just briefly describe again what tenants can expect from their landlords in terms of housing maintenance?
Right. Well, and it's funny, a lot of students go into a place and that's not clean. There's no requirement whatsoever for a landlord to clean a unit between tenants. None.
Wow,
So
I didn't know that.
They are required to remove any rotting garbage, things like that, but they're not required to clean the place. So there's that aspect. But they are required, the vital services like heat, water, electricity, they are required to maintain that. They are required to take care of the property, repair anything that's broken, windows that are cracked, holes in the wall, things like that. They are required to repair. And there is an agency in the City of London that you can contact that would come out, and if it's below standard, they would issue an order to the landlord to fix it. And if the landlord didn't, you could seek a rent reduction to get things taken care of. So I just recommend students contact me if they run into that situation on the way. Like I said, screens on the window during the summer months, minimum heat level of 20 during the day and 18 at night. Like 18 at night to me is cold.
Yeah.
But if the landlord provides 18 at night, that's all they're required to do. And like I said, a lot of students contact us in the summer that their place is like 30, 35, but there's no requirement to keep it below a certain level, which can be problematic. But they have to take care of things like mold or mildew, mice, rodents, bugs. All of that is required by law.
And as Glenn said throughout the presentation, if you do run into these types of problems, make sure you have a written record of that. So you're going to want to, if you're reporting it to your landlord and you call them on the phone, make sure you also send them an email to record the situation and make sure you have a timeline of these events. So you talked earlier about things like mowing the lawn or shoveling snow in the winter. Demir is asking us, that may be one way to get a discount from a landlord, but is there any other way to negotiate a possible discount from the landlord?
Sometimes a landlord will give you a rent discount if you take a longer lease, right? I don't recommend it per se because, lots of people don't know what's going to happen in their life. And, if you sign a longer lease and then you find out the program that you're in is not for you and you want to leave, you still have this lease, extended lease. So you want to be careful about it. But, ask the landlord, are there any chores, anything else I can do for you as a landlord to take care of things? And they might talk to you. Like I know some landlords will take $100 a month off the rent if you take care of cutting the grass and shoveling the snow. That's not a bad discount.
Yeah, for sure.
Probably not much more than that to do, unless they, sometimes they'll have other chores because they've got another business or whatever. But maintenance care, wash the windows, things like that. Maybe take on, if it's a multi-lease property, take on chores like cleaning the place. Because if everybody's on a separate lease, the landlord cannot force any one tenant to clean the place, right? You can force you to clean the bedroom you have, but can't necessarily force you to clean the common areas. So you might say to the landlord, hey, if you give me a discount, I'll vacuum every week, I'll clean whatever every week just to keep everybody happy.
Yeah, so mainly just really good communication with your landlord is your best bet to secure possible discounts, but really just even just staying in touch is a really good idea, just to have issues resolved quickly if you're communicating well with your landlord.
Yeah.
So that is about it for the questions. So with that, I guess we will end our session today. I'd really like to thank you, Glenn, for joining us and providing this very helpful information for students. Again, you're welcome to contact Glenn by email. He's our off-campus housing mediator. So if you just search on the Fanshawe website for off-campus housing, you'll see a link to his contact information. Yeah, so with that, we'll end the session for today. Tomorrow, day 6 of our Fanshawe Cares live session, we will be joined by one of the student life coordinators in the international office, and they're going to be providing information about working while you're studying and how the international office supports you with that. So we do hope that everyone will be able to join us for that session tomorrow as well. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you again, Glenn. And
thanks for joining, everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Take care. Bye, everyone.